everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Nandita Sharma's talk entitled National Citizenship and the Institutionalization of Postcolonial Racism. Nandita Sharma is professor of sociology at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, and she has published widely on topics such as racism, migration, labor, citizenship, and borders. And she's the author of 2 books, Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, and Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants. My mini-conference, I'm Sabrina Axa. I organized one of the mini-conferences here, and my mini-conference co-organizer, Ida Danowit, who couldn't be with us in Amsterdam this weekend, and I asked Nandita to join us today because her work brings together critiques of capitalism, colonialism, and nationalism in new and important ways. We have also both been inspired by her uncompromising support for the No Borders movement. And I asked Ida if she wanted me to add anything to this introduction. And she said that after meeting Nandita in Berlin at another conference a few weeks ago and following her on Twitter for a long time, she was also encouraged by Nandita's scholarly generosity and her support for junior scholars, a practice we sadly still see too rarely in academia. So with all of this being said, please join me in welcoming Nandita Sharma.
So thank you very much, especially to Ida Danowit, Sabrina Axter, who organized the amazing mini-conference called Racial Capitalism and the Global Carceral Empire of Control, as well as to Jackie O'Reilly, who also helped to bring me here as a speaker for this conference, and to all of those whose labor has made this possible, many of them volunteers, and especially Annalise Freiberger of SASE for helping with the logistics. So today's talk is based on my 2020 book, Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants. And just as a warning, there are some images in my slideshow which are disturbing. We live in a world whose political organization in no way corresponds with the way we live our lives. This is true ecologically. It may be a cliche, but it is plainly evident that the Earth's atmosphere is not divided by national boundaries. Greenhouse gases cause the same degree of global warming no matter where they are produced. It is also true economically. Living beings are connected to each other through a cycle of capitalist production and consumption. Almost everything we need and want has been built by many, many people and other living beings. As Emanuel Wallerstein long ago argued, the world capitalist economy is today's only social system. Moreover, the cultures we inhabit have been shaped, often for millennia or longer, by those crisscrossing our planet. People and their ideas have been moving for as long as there have been people. This process has been successively speeding up. While we cannot live without all of the other beings, without whom our lives would come to a swift end, we have a political system of nation states that politically divides us from each other on the basis of nationality. We have nation states who claim land and air and water as their sovereign territory, who claim people, other animals, and plants as theirs, who claim to have the exclusive power to determine who enters their national space and under what terms. Which of the world's nation states one is a citizen of matters. The economist Branko Milanovic has argued that today almost 3/4 of global inequality is due to one's national citizenship, as this graph comparing within country and between country inequality demonstrates. As such, nationals in a rich world nation state, he argues, are provided with a citizenship rent. Now, national citizenship matters because nation states across this international system limit its obtainment. Benedict Anderson long ago pointed out that the national organization of society is one in which the imagined community of the nation is always imagined as a limited community. Because no nation state encompasses all the world's people, nor do they want to, immigration and citizenship controls are crucial technologies for nation-making and nation-maintaining strategies. They are also key technologies for implementing a global apartheid, which, like the South African apartheid of the mid to late 20th century, is based on a differentiated citizenship. In my book, Home Rule, I talk specifically about the political, economic, and social consequences of nation-states' control over human mobility. I trace the shifts in states' governance of people's mobility as the form of state power shifted from the imperial form to the national form. The process of nationalizing state sovereignty began fitfully in the 19th century in the Americas. By the 1960s, the national form of state sovereignty had become the dominant one worldwide. It is at this point that we can say that a new global order emerged, one that I call the post-colonial New World Order. In this new system of governance, people across the world are defined as part of separated nations and ruled through the combined apparatuses of nation-state sovereignty, international bodies, and the global circulation of capital. Established after the end of World War II, post-colonialism marks not the end of the social relationships associated with colonization, but the end of the political legitimacy of imperial state sovereignty and the beginning of the hegemony of national forms of state sovereignty. With astonishing speed, after World War II, the near global space of imperial states was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation-states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from empires. By the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states entering World War II, the British and the French, lost the vast majority of their empires and nationalized the sovereignties of their imperial metropoles in Europe. Each marked their newfound national sovereignty by implementing citizenship and immigration controls, largely initially affecting those from its former colonies. For those colonized people who did not obtain national sovereignty, the demand for it nevertheless defines their struggles. For many who identify as Hawaiians or Mohawks, Armenians or Kurds, Palestinians or Kashmiris, their struggles are often framed as struggles for national liberation. It is thus clear that in the post-colonial New World Order, being a member of a nation in possession of territorial sovereignty is mostly unquestioned. This is not surprising, as in this system, it's only by organizing as a nation can claims to power be heard. This is not an accident. While a lot of attention has been paid to the dominant part played by the United States in the post-World War II world order, what is often ignored is how critical the U.S. was to the hegemony of post-colonial rule. Although the U.S. is often called an empire and its acts of aggression and theft imperialism, it is far better understood, I would argue, as the dominant nation-state in a world of national sovereigns. Having nationalized its own sovereignty starting in 1875 with the passing of its first immigration controls, the Page Act, the United States played a pivotal role in ending empires and establishing the global rule of nation-states. Shortly before the end of World War II, it was the United States that insisted that the doctrine of national self-determination become the basis of a restructured global capitalist economy. We know that after World War I, U.S. President Wilson's doctrine of self-rule had been enshrined in the League of Nations. At that time, however, this doctrine didn't apply to people in the colonies of imperial states. Empires at that time were willing to reimagine their metropoles as national societies, but they well knew that extending such a status to their colonies would result in the collapse of imperial rule. By 1941, however, with metropolitan France under Nazi occupation and the British metropole under siege, Britain was desperate for the U.S. help in fighting the Axis powers. The United States seized the opportunity to demand a reorganization of the still largely imperial world to its advantage. That year, President Roosevelt succeeded in having British Prime Minister Churchill accept the extension of the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule to the natives in the colonies. Their agreement was sealed in the 1941 Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was far from an expression of solidarity with the colonized on the part of the U.S. The U.S. could not have been any less interested in giving up expropriated land, including the lands comprising U.S. national territory, or ending the exploitation of people's labor power. Neither would it countenance the creation of a world without hierarchies of worth and disparities in wealth, power, and peace. Instead, the U.S. understood that imperial state monopolies over their colonies prevented capitalists headquartered in the U.S. from exploiting these same territories and the people in them. Empires simply stood in the way of the U.S. becoming a world hegemon. The basis of U.S. support for expanding the principle of national self-determination to the colonies was the understanding that it would gain from the opening of closed imperial markets for land, labor, and commodities. Such an opening would be achieved by the transformation of both imperial metropoles and imperial colonies into independent sovereign nation-states, each enmeshed in an international regime of financial, political, and military ties. In short, as one of the world's first nation-states, the U.S. wanted to universalize the nation-state form in order to seize the markets monopolized by imperial states. The U.S., of course, was wildly successful in achieving its goals. The universal principle of self-rule agreed to in the 1941 Atlantic Charter formed the basis for the first major international political institution of post-colonialism, the United Nations. In its 1945 founding charter, the UN enshrined the recognition of the right of national self-determination, or the right to national sovereignty for those people who could successfully claim to being a people, with a capital P, as the bedrock of international law. Yet in no place on earth were all the people living in any given territory considered to be members of the nation who could claim sovereignty over territory and people. Hostility to migrants was bred in the bone of the UN Charter. With its declaration of the rights of national self-determination, it would not, nor could it, account for the rights of all those people who were not the people of the nation. Those regarded as non-members of the nation were reimagined as migrants, people said to have moved to the nation's territory at some point in the past or future. They became the people out of place in contrast to the supposedly self-determinate people of a place. Now, of course, human beings have moved since there have been human beings on the planet, indeed even before there were Homo sapiens. Nationalists freeze history at a time when those claiming national belonging come on the scene. As events following the end of World War II showed, the UN Charter on National Self-Determination stood in stark contrast to how many people actually lived, and certainly in stark contrast to the reality of the immediate post-World War II experience of mass migration. Indeed, efforts to sort people out into their proper national places spurred enormous movements of people, including the 1947 partition of British India into Pakistan and India, as well as the 1948 expulsion of Palestinians from the new nation-state of Israel and the related expulsion of Jewish people across the Maghreb. This beggars the question, who is national sovereignty good for? Contrary to the rhetoric of national liberation or the bromides of the United Nations, this world of nation-states did not represent a challenge to the social relations of colonialism. Instead, post-colonialism worked to contain the revolutionary and liberatory demands of people to abolish the practices of expropriation and exploitation most closely associated with imperialism. Instead of getting their land back and ending the exploitation of their labor, more land was taken away and more people were forced to rely on their access to the capitalist wage for their survival. Indeed, the new international system provided the institutional structures and the legitimized force of coercive state action for capitalist social relations to expand, which they did to a scale and scope previously unimagined. This expansion occurred through, not against, the nationalization of states, sovereignty, territory, and subjectivity. Claiming to have liberated people, postcolonialism liberated capital instead. The postcolonial New World Order is thus not only a particular historical period, the post-World War II era, or the body of scholarship trying to understand it. Postcolonialism is the governmentality of the international system of nation-states and the equally international system of capitalist social relations. One poignantly captured by the proverb, "When the axe came into the woods, many of the trees said, 'At least the handle is one of us.'" Yet, even though this world of nation-states does not work for most of the world's people, people are far more likely to talk about imperialism or neo-colonialism than they are to take a cold, hard look at the work of nationalisms and nation-states. Support for nationalism and for nation-states remains hegemonic across the left-right political spectrum. National sovereignty continues to be seen as the last bastion of resistance against foreign incursions. As new nations and new nation-states form while older ones dissolve, new national liberation movements arise to remake the borders of nationalized territory and set different limits for membership in the nation. National citizenship and immigration controls are together the key technologies for the material and cultural realization of post-colonial ruling relations. National citizenship and immigration regimes represent the institutionalization of what I call post-colonial racism, wherein racialized and gender discourses are reformulated in discourses over nationality. Documents that mark one's nationality are today's crucial technologies of racism. The utilization of nationality as a method to bring racism into people's lives is the ruler's reaction to the success of post-World War II efforts to delegitimize the sort of racist ideologies that held up fascist politics. From the 1950s onward, racism became increasingly unacceptable in mainstream politics. Academics wrote landmark reports, including for UNESCO, that showed that race was merely a calculated invention and in no way reflected actual differences amongst human beings. Those continuing to declare themselves racist were regarded as extremists. Concomitantly, the popular understanding of what constituted racism associated it only with extreme acts of denigration and/or violence. Yet racism remains a powerfully violent force around the world. In every place on earth, some people's lives and liberties are valued more than others. How do we make sense of the continued force of racism in the absence of racist laws stipulating differential treatment, including in the regulation of migration? The enormous legitimacy attached to nationalism is, I believe, part of the answer. After World War II, even as scientists debunked ideas of race and challenged practices of racism in response to the horrors of fascist holocausts, they remained silent about nationalism. It was as if nationalism had had nothing to do with murderous fascist violence. Mahmoud Mamdani, in his new book, Neither Native Nor Settler, shows how the Allies' insistence on treating Nazism as simply the criminal acts of individual perpetrators to be tried, judged, and sometimes executed by the victors at Nuremberg left as unquestioned the philosophical and structural basis for the idea of the nation. This is puzzling, to say the least, for two reasons. First, the Nazis represented their political project as a national reawakening of a slumbering and complacent German nation that had allowed its historical homeland to be polluted by foreign others. The Nazis' racism was enacted as part of their project to purify the German nation through state actions. The 1935 Reich citizenship law, revoking the German citizenship of Jewish people, is a prime example of this. Borrowing from aristocratic notions of bloodlines, the Nuremberg laws limited membership in the German nation-state to those having German or related blood. Ideas of the German Herrenvolk, or master race, thus depended on the state practice of limiting national citizenship. A supplementary decree in November 1935 expanded the list of people ineligible for German national citizenship because of their supposedly inferior race. The representation of, quote, gypsies, Negroes, and their bastards, unquote, as well as people deemed to have, quote, mental and or genetic deformities, unquote, as non-members of the German race, and making them non-Germans in the law by stripping them of their German citizenship were all related processes. The assumed association between German blood and loyalty to the German people and Reich served to define all non-Germans living within German territories as deportable. The Nazis' plan to expel those the state made foreigners and enemies of the people failed in no small part because of the immigration policies of states around the world, which also regarded the victims of fascism as undesirable people in their own budding nations. It was after many failed attempts to deport them that the Nazi concentration camps became death camps. Secondly, the silence on the Nazis' nationalism during the Nuremberg trials occurred precisely when the world of imperial states was being transformed into a world of nation-states. Shortly after World War II, state sovereignty was nearly universally nationalized. Each new nation-state enacted immigration controls in an effort to shape national membership. Practices of exclusion or differential inclusion grounded in nationalism were regarded not only as legitimate, but as practically mandatory in politics. Borrowing from the long history of racializing nationality, the impossibility of national belonging for those seen as out of place became just an everyday part of politics. Separating nationals from migrants is the leitmotif of post-colonial rule, and its power is far from spent. In fact, the post-colonial politics of separating nationals and migrants is hardening and expanding in ever more uncanny ways. Across the world system of nation-states, a further contraction of the already limited criteria of national belonging has taken place around the figure that I call the national native. Borrowing the imperial meaning of natives as colonized people, national natives see themselves as colonized by migrants. This has led to an enormous expansion of the term colonizer to encompass all those regarded as migrants, even regardless of their legal status, since many social migrants are actually co-citizens. In turn, migrants' own experience of colonization is seen as unimportant and unpolitical. In this regard, the politics of autochthony are critical to the normalization of post-colonial racism. So what is autochthony? Derived from the Greek autos, self, and ton, earth, an autochthon was one, originally in the plural, who had literally, quote, sprung from the earth, unquote. The term referred to, quote, an original or indigenous inhabitant of a place. The term indigenous is also from classical Greece. To be indigenous was to be born inside, with the class connotation of being born inside the house, being the master. Like autochthon, indigenous denoted someone or something born or produced naturally in a land or region, native or belonging naturally to the soil, region, etc. according to the Oxford English Dictionary. The politics of autochthony are always relational. The counterpart to an autochthonous or indigenous people are people regarded as allochtons, predicated on the Greek allo, referring to that which is other or different, and the Indo-European allo, referring to someone or something else. Allochthonous first became part of our lexicon in the mid-19th century and arose through the discipline of geology, which used it to refer to something, quote, originating or formed in a place other than where found. Allochthonous has that meaning in the Oxford English Dictionary. It was sometime later when people rather than rocks came to be defined as allochtons. Today, autochthonous discourses restrict political membership to those who can show that they are native to the national polity. Thus, even though the state category of native, which marked the status of colonial subjecthood, was thought to have disappeared as colonized natives became independent nationals, it's becoming clear that embedded in each idea of national sovereignty or home rule is the notion that true nationals are those who are natives of its territories. These are the national natives. Autochthonous politics present the world as if each nation has its own place in the world. The idea of a world composed of distinct and seemingly equivalent nationalities is what allows nation-states to effect racist exclusions without naming race. Nationalism carries on the work of racism, both of which posit, quote, a natural division of the world's population into discrete categories, according to Robert Miles. Political membership in nations predicated on autochthony thus manifest racialized ideas of essentialist origins in territorialized form. This is postcolonial racism. By restricting the making of claims to sovereignty, territory, and rights to those who are national natives, discourses of autochthony produce borders even more fortified and difficult to cross than are those erected between national and migrant. While it's conceivable that one could become a national citizen, it's nearly impossible to become native. Today, national autochthony is increasingly important to nationalist projects, both from above and from below. Placing people into separated categories of national natives and migrants is no trifling matter. The legal and/or social separation of national natives and migrants animates deadly conflicts around the world. A particularly stark example took place in the national liberation state of Myanmar, formerly Burma, where the separation of national natives and migrants formed the basis for what many have called the world's most recent genocide, this time against Rohingya people. Nation-state officials and popular Buddhist monks categorize mostly Muslim Rohingya people as, quote, illegal Bengali migrants, unquote, and argued that expelling them from both the nation and its sovereign territory is necessary for the defense not only of national society, but for the defense of the indigenous people of Myanmar. In 2017, approximately 740,000 Rohingya were forced to flee Myanmar, mostly heading to Bangladesh, where they are detained in refugee camps. Having been socially constituted as migrants in Myanmar, many were forced to flee and become migrants in the law. There are many other stark examples in what have been termed the national liberation states. For example, the deadly conflicts between supposed natives and supposed migrants in Darfur and Rwanda. We also have the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, the military coups against Asian parliamentary leaders by indigenous chiefs in Fiji from the 1980s into the 2000s, and the expulsion of Asians from Uganda in the throes of Idi Amin's African indigenization project in 1972. We have moral panics over migrant invasions in Europe, which have spurred violence and provided the political foundations for a growing authoritarianism. In the former British white settler colonies, the distinction between settlers and immigrants is collapsing as the white in white settler colonies is dropped. In indigenous nationalist movements, every non-native is increasingly regarded as a, quote, settler colonist, including most egregiously those groups who were expressly excluded from the white settler colonial project: Black people, Latinx people, and Asian people, all of whom can now be depicted as colonizers of indigenous national natives by virtue of their presence on native territory. In the process, the very act of moving is made into an act of colonization, further shoring up the autochthonous view of the world, wherein every people with a capital P have their place, and mobility results in people being out of place. Such a hardening of nationalisms is at the same time an intensification of post-colonial racism. While these many different instances of autochthonous nationalisms are not equivalent to one another, white supremacists are not the same as Buddhist monks advocating genocide in Myanmar, neither are the same as indigenous people in the US or Australia arguing that the descendants of slaves and quote-unquote coolie workers are settler colonists. However, there are important similarities in the different uses of autochthonous discourses, and these are not merely semantic. Autochthonous discourses, like all racist discourses, rely on the portrayal of nativeness as an essential, unpolitical characteristic of some specified group of people, a characteristic that sets them apart from all others. In this sense, autochthonous discourses are truly relational. They produce some people as migrants, as the negative others of national natives. The deployment of autochthonous discourses thus reveals a crucial feature of post-colonial power. All nationalisms are fundamentally autochthonous and productive of a post-colonial racism that organizes a hierarchical separation between national natives, the autochthons, and migrants, the alloctons. Across the world and across the political spectrum, from the left to the far right, the prerogative of national natives is the right to home rule. In the process, migrants are left without a home in this world. And this brings me to my final point, decolonization. To start, we must recognize that the very terms of decolonization have been utterly co-opted. The fact that the very practices denounced by anti-colonial movements as imperialist, the expropriation of land, the exploitation of labor, the oppression of the colonized, continue unimpeded in every nationally sovereign state. This is the truth that is rarely spoken to post-colonial power. The continuing significance of movements for national self-determination, both in existing nation states and in movements for new national sovereigns, has left us with an understanding of colonialism as nothing more than foreign rule. Consequently, decolonization has become nothing more than home rule, the elevation of national natives over migrants. This has worked to contain anti-colonial demands by allowing nationalists of all stripes to make the case that the reason national sovereignty has not yet delivered what it promised is the existence of foreigners in the nation's territory. The result has been a hardening of nationalisms and a resultant increase in anti-immigrant politics. Indeed, anti-colonialism has largely been redefined as anti-immigration, and contenders for political power in rich and poor worlds alike bemoan their lack of national independence. Yet it is abundantly clear that the nation-state, any nation-state, is wholly incapable of delivering on the promises of decolonization. This is not because it doesn't have enough national sovereignty, as theorists of neocolonialism argue, but because of the global arena in which capitalism operates and because of the relationship between ruling classes and state power. This is glaringly so with regard to national citizenship and immigration controls, which have from the start been a response to crises in capitalism. The subordinate state categories that a growing number of people on the move are placed in, categories such as temporary foreign worker or illegal, sometimes couched in the new law and order category of victims of trafficking, have done two main things: provide flexible and relatively cheaper labor power, and politically separate workers from one another within what is obviously a world market for labor power that has been nationalized. Anti-immigrant politics only create more competition within labor markets nationalized through citizenship and immigration controls. More nationalism leads to more anti-immigrant politics, which leads to the further cheapening of migrants, which leads to more competition, which leads to more nationalism, more competition, and more cheapened migrants ad infinitum. While portrayed as benefiting citizens by elevating them above migrants, in reality, citizenship and immigration controls harm all workers. To acknowledge this is to acknowledge the failure of nation-states. To avoid addressing this reality, nation-states endlessly replay the fight against colonialism, for this positions them as the defenders of the nation rather than the managers of ruling relations. This is why new colonizers have to be constantly produced, and why migrants, the quintessential people out of place, can be represented as settler colonists invading native nations. The existence of new colonizers normalizes national native sovereignty. I believe that we can renew our commitment to decolonization by calling for an end to the National Liberation Project. Rejecting racist, nationalist ideas of a territorialized self is a critical step in undoing post-colonial rule. To move from our present of social, economic, political, and climate catastrophe, we need to transform our relationships to one another and to our shared planet. It needs to be truly shared in order for all of us to survive. No other set of relationships other than that provided by the commons is capable, I would argue, of creating the conditions wherein one small group of human beings do not succeed in forcing the rest of us into a necropolis. A world in common is a world without borders and boundaries that establish differential value and worth of living beings. A decolonized world is one in which people are free to move and to stay. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. So I'm not sure what the process is. Are there any comments or questions? Or I'm not sure if we have time for that or, okay.
Thank you very much for this extremely impressive presentation. You haven't talked too much about privilege, but I assume that it's not too difficult to obtain the citizenship of Sierra Leone. The countries where we are coming from, that's much more difficult. So it's probably people from the privileged countries who have more responsibility in changing the situation than other people. What could we do?
Well, I think first of all, you're absolutely right, that this world of nation states is a highly uneven one, and citizenship in rich world states, as I mentioned, Branko Milanovic talks about it as a form of rent, right? This privilege that we get. I think what we can do is to actually challenge who we think we are, right? Is to form different kinds of lines of solidarity and connection and shared notions of subjectivity other than the ones that we have today, which, the dominant ones are race and nation, right? We see each other as members of different races, as members of different nations, and we forget that that was a social process, right? There was a set of ruling relationships that encouraged us to think of ourselves that way so that we don't have the political power to challenge class rule, state rule. So I think starting with changing who we think we are is really, really critical. calling for a leveling, a social leveling of people across the world, calling for an end to citizenship is a corollary of calling for an end to no borders. I mean, calling for an end to the border regimes that organize inequality. So I think that those are starting points for what we can do. Yep.
Thanks a lot for that. And let's ask about the relationship between what you're arguing here and issues around democracy. So the last point you made about the abolition of citizenship being a correlate of the abolition of borders seems completely right. The way we currently organize democracies is very much as national democracies. And it's, it'd be completely fair to argue that that produces often very toxic results. However, it does seem like democracy is something we tend to value quite a lot in all sorts of places on the political spectrum. So I was wondering if you can speculate on the way in which your arguments, what they imply for the organization of democratic collectives.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think that anti-immigrant politics are a consequence of the lack of democracy in people's lives, right? Like we have these formal liberal democracies, and I don't mean to diminish at all the significance of liberal democracies over fascist regimes, right? I think we need to pay attention to the differences between those two things. But I do think that anti-immigrant politics is a consequence of the fact that there is a fundamental lack of democracy over the conditions of people's lives, right? And many people have been talking about this forever. We may be able to vote, but we don't get to vote on whether we want to be part of the proletariat or whether we would like to have some other kind of socioeconomic conditions that organize our continued survival. So I do think that that's one thing, is to recognize that we don't actually live in democracies that are capable of producing peace, stability, security for people in the world, and that organizing democracies as national democracies is inherently productive of the kind of violence that we see within nation states and across the system of nation states. So how do we organize a democracy? I just briefly touched on the work that is being done on the contemporary demands for a commons, which would be a planetary commons. And I think the key political basis for the commons is the power to not be excluded, right? The current world that we live in has largely two sets of rights: private property rights, which is the right to exclude people from enjoyment of that which the private property owner holds title to, and citizenship rights, right, which enable states to exclude people who they're not going to grant citizenship to. The commons, on the other hand, is a completely different social, economic, political system, one based on the power to not be excluded. And so if we can even fathom what it would be like to live in a world where we can't actually exclude one another from enjoyment of a shared, common treasury, which is our planet, right? What kind of social relationships would that produce? What kinds of systems of democracy would that create? I think those are the kinds of questions that, many people who are writing, theorizing, about past commons and future commons are currently working on, so I could direct you to that body of literature. Yes?
Thank you, very interesting presentation. I was a bit surprised that you managed to describe us the history of the 20th century without mentioning the Soviet Union, which is actually a great project of abandoning the national state. Yes, all the ideology of international solidarity of people and so on. But actually this project degenerated. It was also a huge machine of human oppression. So the question is how to do this thing, express that picture, which is a beautiful idea, but without risk of generating another mechanism of oppressing people.
Yeah, I think I fundamentally agree with you that the USSR was a major violent political force in the world. But I would disagree that it didn't incorporate nationalism as part of its ruling project, right? You only have to think of Stalin's famous 1922 quote of, we're going against internationalism. This is 5 years after the revolution, right? We're going against internationalism and towards socialism in one country, right? And the recognition of the quote-unquote nationhood of, and the incorporation of different quote-unquote nationally self-determinant people as Soviet republics, right? I think so nationalism was not outside of the USSR system, right? We didn't have a system of the US defending national self-determination and the USSR, calling for some kind of international. We actually had two competing powers after World War II during the Cold War, both of which manipulated and organized their financial leverage of providing capital to their client states through ideas of national self-determination, right? So I think that the critique of the USSR is not outside of this general critique of post-colonial racisms. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you so much for this. In many ways, it's very highly persuasive, but one thing that I would like you to say more about your thoughts on would be about certain kinds of claims for sovereignty and nationhood that pre-existed the sort of post-World War II, post-colonial world order. And I guess I'm thinking specifically about the ways in which it's been enormously important for indigenous nations, First Nations, and Native American communities to claim sovereignty and nationhood against the settler colonialism, right? And again, that sort of struggles has pre-existed this particular post-colonial notion and were explicitly excluded from the kinds of self-determination that were kind of enshrined in international law. And I guess thinking about this idea of kind of this common land for everyone seems like in this case would be another kind of recipe justification for further dispossession from indigenous communities. And I know
yes.
Some of the language of indigeneity and separate colonialism gets kind of used in different circumstances, different ways. I wonder if you could talk specifically about that a little more.
Yeah, I think that first of all, the use of ideas like nation or race to self-define indigenous quote-unquote communities in Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, elsewhere in the world, Israel, India, et cetera, is new, right? These are not timeless ways that people who we now understand as indigenous peoples of those places talked about themselves. It's relatively new, and it's primarily in the same period of time that people around the world started imagining themselves as nations, right? So it's late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, throughout the 20th century, intensifying in the former British white settler colonies after World War II, right? So it follows actually the trajectory of everywhere else. So in that sense, these are not exceptional kinds of political movements. And secondly, I think the project that I'm engaged in right now, critiquing indigeneity as the basis for political power and for territorial sovereignty, is primarily to argue that this is not a pathway out of colonization, right? That achieving national sovereignty has not led to an end of the practices that people fighting colonialism demanded, right? I think one of the projects that really desperately needs to be done is pulling together all of the anti-colonial struggles around the world that did not center on nationalism, right? That national liberation struggles were competing with, right? And that, of course, national liberation struggles won. So that's one point. And the second point of, currently Indigenous people in Canada, Australia, United States, et cetera, are, wholly unable to achieve national territorial sovereignty, right? But again, I would argue that that's not an exceptional situation. It's very actually difficult to find, very many nation states across the world where there aren't competing claims to territorial sovereignty, right? So I would say that the whole system in which we imagine ourselves as nations, particularly native nations, who have an inherent right to territorial sovereignty, is the basis for producing ever more new claims to nations and new claims to sovereignty, right? So it's never ending. So not only does national sovereignty not deliver anti-colonial demands, it also creates the new conditions for ever more demands for different national sovereigns, right? So one last thing I'll just say about that is one of the key things that defines all nationalist projects from above and from below is the absolute refusal to talk about class, right? The absolute refusal to talk about the fact that there are people in every single nation who are more than ready and willing to take up state power and to use that state power to ensure the exploitation of land and labor, right? And so that's the kind of, again, truth that is, not really spoken to national liberation struggles, right? Yes?
Thank you for your talk. So I was wondering, there are many, I was thinking about immigration, but then also criminal justice, right? And the ways that the proliferation of mass incarceration has played a role in this movement. And in terms of setting up systems of exclusion, one of the things I was thinking about is the way that the language of safety is often used to say, well, we have to exclude some people because they are violent or they are unsafe. So I was wondering if you could just respond to that claim that some of these systems are meant to exclude people who would cause harm. I just want to hear more about what you think about that, or what you would say to those who use safety as one of the justifications for the way that this is working.
Yeah, I think that the discourse of safety and security are absolutely central to all forms of state rule, right? Whether they're national rule or imperial rule or monarchical rule or, whichever kind of state form we're talking about. Like there's always, it's classic. It's the kind of Hobbesian and pre-Hobbesian notion that we've all entered into a contract to give the state our power so that it could keep us safe, right? So that's just kind of hard baked into the existence of states. So I would say that, and the processes of racialization, gendering, class rule, nationalization are, I would argue, ideological forms of really not addressing the division between rulers and those that they rule over, right? And so there always is going to be, in any system of rule, going to be a mechanism of division, right? And which mechanism is used at any given historical moment is going to be shaped not only from above, but weirdly also from below, right? Like the kinds of demands that we make, for example, for home rule, then are twisted and co-opted to allow for the continuation of ruling relations. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I really like the idea, but I thought I wanted to, but then I kind of tried to think, okay, what would this mean for my life? And I just want to put this to you, because I thought like, I think in a world without autochthonous concepts, I would be out of a job. I wouldn't find a job because people, yeah, because like, okay, I make it concrete, like, in the German academic labor market, autochthonous concepts, I think, are applied. So there are ways to rig the market in a way that it favors Germans, like for these positions. But if we do away with these kind of concepts, then the as academics, I suppose, could take over, because the epistemic capital of the metropolis is very higher. A degree from Yale University is regarded to have a higher value than a degree from a German university. So you see what I'm getting at, like without borders wouldn't the sides of the people with more capital, like with more epistemic capital, just take over?
Yeah, no, I first of all, let me thank you for your honesty. It's not always easy to acknowledge the rent that we gain from national citizenship, especially in a rich world state like Germany, right? So thank you for your honesty. It's very unusual. But also, secondly, you know, a call for no borders is not a policy recommendation, right? This isn't in the world of parliamentary committees or congressional committees where you say, I have this idea, like, let's just get rid of nation states and global capitalism, right? So this is a revolutionary project, and it's one that requires a change of subjectivity, but also a demand for a change in the social relations of production, right, and reproduction. When I imagine a world with no borders, it's not this world with no borders, right? It's a world without capitalist social relationships and no borders. It's a world without state power and no borders, right? So competition in labor markets is absolutely central to capitalism, right? And that competition has been nationalized through citizenship and immigration controls to provide people like you and me with the rent of our German or US citizenship, right? But so it requires a kind of revolutionary understanding of this world that we live in is not sustainable, right? Like, we are on a precipice right now. The world that we have of state power, of global capital, of the enormous political divisions amongst us so that we cannot fight state and capital is leading to perhaps the annihilation of life on this planet, right? So it's just, we cannot actually continue going on this way. So I think so I am calling for a change in the system that you're talking about, but not in a way that will destroy your life, but possibly make it better and even possible. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming and the questions.